Hey folks, Roger here. It's been, I think, years since I made that initial library tour video. Now, so many of my friends and family honored me by taking time to watch, but also so many of you that I've never met face to face found that video online and took the time to walk with me through these thousands of years worth of books and great ideas. Well, several of you have asked me, perhaps it's time to do an updated state of the library, if you will, and I think the time is appropriate. I've kept reading. I've spent thousands of more hours since making those last videos, wrestling with difficult books and thinking things through. And the library has expanded a bit, and I thought it might be a good time to show you. But before I show you the state of the library, I wanted to remind you of something that I suggested a couple of years ago. And that is to remind you I didn't start in my life enjoying reading. I read just what was necessary and required of me, and very little more, because perhaps I didn't have the attention, perhaps it was I didn't feel I had the time or would rather be doing something more useful, but I think also it was because I just knew in my mind that I was staring at these pages and I could read it, I knew what the words were, but I just had a hard time wrestling the information or understanding out of that book. So I could stare at these pages and go through them and not get what I knew I needed to get out of them. So if that's you, don't be discouraged. It's normal. Don't be hard on yourself. I, to this day, am still trying to perfect my skill at understanding books and seeing how ideas fit together. I think we're all able to grow. So just see it as a journey, a progress, a process, and start somewhere. Don't set unobtainable goals. Just start somewhere. Hey, this is a difficult book. This had big impact on culture. I'm going to spend a little bit of time in this. I'm going to turn off the Xbox and Facebook for a while and just live in this book for a little while. And go from there. Start somewhere. And but don't be discouraged with yourself. So a gentleman named Mortimer Adler years ago wrote a book called How to Read a Book. And he pointed out something about American and Western culture more broadly. And that is, thankfully, we're literate. Many of us are literate. But unfortunately, we're very busy and distracted. So though we're literate, we're not deeply literate. We don't read very well. We just read widely. And I think it's gotten worse since the gentleman wrote this book, because we're so distracted with so many news articles and online comments and even just consumer entertainment products, many of which we read, but it just sort of clutters our mind. And we're not good at wrestling with deep ideas in difficult books and piecing them together. We're very busy and we just cram lots of things in our minds. But he said that, and it's something I've noticed as well, that I like the way he worded it. He pointed out in his book, How to Read a Book, that the highest form of reading is to think syntopically. And that is to not see all the big ideas from history, from all the great human minds of the past in isolation, but try to see how they fit together. It's sort of like chemistry and physics in high school. You take those classes separately, and you might think of chemistry and physics as different subjects, but when you go a little bit deeper, you understand that those are very intimately connected topics. Well, I think the same is true for religion and political philosophy and art and culture and science and all the big things that we wrestle with as human beings. Those are things that are intimately connected. And to tell you a little bit about where I am in my own journey, well, I think I've told you before, I was in Christian ministry and was getting ready to shift gears to minister in a different capacity. And my doubts about the faith sort of overcame me, and I very nearly became an atheist. I thank God for a friend who kind of helped me, walked with me through my doubts, and showed me that the Christian faith is plausible, but perhaps you have some misunderstandings about some of the cultural issues. Well, I've still been studying, and I'll tell you what, sometimes when you set out on a difficult study, you think you're just going to confirm what you already believe. But sometimes with overwhelming evidence, when you see the fuller picture, you have to amend your beliefs. And that's happened to me a bit. So I have had very secular ideas and very Baptist ideas sort of mingled together in my head at war. Well, I think it's safe to say, and I think many of you would probably agree, that modernity has gotten some things wrong. The modern world isn't totally perfect. I think that's safe to say. So I found myself no longer wrestling with atheism. I don't think it has the answers. I don't think it's plausible. I understand why people believe it. I understand why people don't believe Christianity. Though for my own part, I find myself convinced by the evidence for the existence and resurrection of Jesus of Nazareth, and I find myself, when I think syntopically about the nature of the universe, about meaning and beauty and morality, the grounding of being, I found myself believing that God exists. And that's independent of religious experiences, but those help me too. But the more I've studied, the more I've pieced things together, the more I think I've looked towards ancient Christianity before all the culture wars we face in the last 100, 200, 300, 400 years today. And I think not that they had everything together, not that they had all the answers, but I do think that ancient Christianity had some things that perhaps we've lost. And those are things I've really wrestled with. But I'll share some of that with you. Hey, but whatever you're at in your life, whether you're a believer, a non-believer, whether you're a Muslim, whether you're a Buddhist, wherever you're at, whether you're a Baptist Christian, I'd just like to encourage you to keep thinking and studying and reading, and I'm going to try to do the same. Well, I hope this video is a little fun for you and a little encouraging. Let's get to it, shall we? Welcome to my library. I was away on a business trip and my wife was very kind to have this built for me. I've got my Legos up there. As a kid, I always wanted to have a shelf to display my Legos. Well, there they are. My wife was very kind to have this built, but I do think she might have had an ulterior motive. My books tend to creep around the house a bit. And she might have wanted to keep them all in one spot. This is actually a little bit of a lie, because typically I'm studying some topic and all this just comes off the shelves and all over the floor in the living room and the desk and stacks. But I cleaned it up for you. Hope it's a little bit more presentable. But I'm going to walk you through this in just a minute. But I still have the library in sort of a semi-chronological, semi-topical order. And of course I've got more books on my Nook and on Audible. I'm listening to Sean Carroll, Jesus and John Wayne, some critical race theory stuff, just kind of current events. But I'll give you an overview and then I will sort of walk you through it. So, this is Ancient Christianity, those books up top here. These are the first few hundred years of Christian writings that we have. And that's really helped me for multiple reasons. If I doubted that we could depend on what the New Testament says is accurate to the originals, well, hey, you can reproduce the New Testament just from them quoting it. It's pretty helpful, actually. And another thing that's been a bit of a dual-edged sword is I can see what the early Christians believed about all the hot-button debates in Christianity. And some of those things have really challenged me. But it's also encouraging because I have confidence that many of the beliefs I hold most dear as a Christian believer, they go back all the way to the apostles, so that's helpful. Well, then I have just theology and more theology, apologetics, and then over here I've got some more fundamentalist type books, and some other just basic theologies. This shelf's kind of a mismatch. Down here I've got Jack Kirby, one of the first appearances of Darkseid in DC Comics. And over here I've got just fun books. I'm trying to understand literature. Not just literature, but just kind of popular level entertainment books. And how people put their ideas into those books. How the rhythm of those books works. Why successful books are successful. I've got the letters of Tolkien and Lewis. I've got some neat examples. And this is just a shortcoming in my understanding. I don't know a lot about these kind of books, so I'm learning. I've got a classic E. Nesbitt. Neil Gaiman is one of the most popular writers right now. He recommended that one. And then, of course, I've got some mythology, some Dostoevsky, Joseph Campbell. Now, Joseph Campbell, that's the guy that George Lucas got a hold of when he was young. And those books were trying to show the similarities in all the great stories of various human cultures. And that really grasped George Lucas's mind. And from that, we got Star Wars. This is actually one of my favorite fiction books. It's sort of postmodern. It's sort of an argument against the Enlightenment idea that we can just reason and science ourselves into success. But it's sort of reminding us that there are always things beyond your control. There are always things that reason just can escape human reason. Those black swans, if you will. And man, it's just great. I don't even fully agree with what the author is saying, but it's just a great book. Dante's Inferno. This is Bullfinch's Mythology. This is sort of a cleaned up Victorian telling of ancient pagan myths. But back to my theology. So there's American theology, B.B. Warfield, the Fundamentalists, the early Fundamentalists, Jonathan Edwards. And then we've got, I'm just a skeptical person by nature, so I wanted sort of photocopies. We have about over 5,800 manuscripts of the New Testament from the ancient world, and it's really impressive. But we know, even skeptical scholars like Bart Ehrman will say, hey, we know within 99% confidence what the original writings in the New Testament said. Well, I'm a skeptical guy, so I kind of just wanted to see that for myself. But I studied some of this stuff. This is a Greek translation of the Bible. The early Christians, I think even the New Testament writers would have used the Septuagint. Oftentimes when the New Testament writers quote the Old Testament, they're quoting the Septuagint. And boy, that should be a conversation right there. Early Christian Doctrines, that's by an Anglican scholar. It's just very challenging when you start reading what these guys said. This is two different takes on how to make sense of church history. One Protestant and one former Protestant who became Catholic. They're both interesting. That should probably be a video in of itself. We'll just kind of jump over here to philosophy. All right, so this is semi-chronological, semi-topical. I've showed you many of these books before, but we've got great books on, they just kind of break down philosophy to you. Frederick Copleston, I've got several volumes by him. These are just great. I used to recommend Bertrand Russell's A History of Western Philosophy, but Copleston's are just better. Well, philosophy really began before Socrates, but we say with Socrates. Someone once said that all Western philosophy are really just footnotes to Plato, and there's some truth to that. To blind myself to Plato or Aristotle would be to blind myself to the world I live in. Doesn't mean they had it all together, it just means that they had a lot of things right, and they've influenced everything. Some mythology here, Peloponnesian Wars, Thucydides, things you've seen before. Hey, some Norse and Viking poems. Robert Graves, he's passed away now, but it's a more recent version of telling of the old myths. And some of these books, believe it or not, are quoted in the New Testament. So the Apostle Paul, when he would preach to pagan peoples, he would quote some of this stuff. So some of this stuff is in the New Testament. A lot of Christians don't know that. It's interesting. Coming on down, these are not totally, there's Captain Picard. These are not totally chronological. But the order kind of makes sense to me. Some of this, Augustine, he could be up there with the Christians, and I have a lot of him up there. But I kind of put some of him in the chronological sections too. Cambridge Companion to Dante, books that influenced science. But we're going to go from the Greeks and the Romans all the way down to beginnings of the modern world, English civilization, rise and fall of the British Empire. These are early modern philosophers, Thomas Hobbes, writers like John Milton. There's Columbus's Four Voyages, Immanuel Kant, Edmund Burke. Well, if you don't know, Edmund Burke watched the French Revolution with some amount of horror. He supported the American Revolution, but he really despised the French Revolution, I think for obvious reasons. And he offered some thoughts on culture that I think are very helpful, which really kind of helped me. This is an interesting book on greed and sort of pre-modern capitalism, but The Fable of the Bees, interesting. Old Rene Descartes. So, I bought this book years ago, but it's interesting because Descartes is considered the first modern philosopher. And though I bought this years ago, I find myself revisiting it recently. The reason for that is because I think modernity's got a lot of things wrong, and I don't think all of our issues started within the last 5 years. I think we've had increasing issues for a long time. Well, Rene Descartes lived in a time in the 1500s. He lived in the very real cultural shifts and upheavals that were taking place during the Protestant Reformation in Europe. So he lived through a war in Europe that I think 4 to 8 million people died. And those wars were political, sure, over power, sure, but they were caused over people not knowing what type of state or society they should have, and the traditional established social order that really was this alliance between Catholicism and the state. They still had Aristotle's view of politics to some degree. They thought that the state's goal wasn't just to maximize liberty, but to promote what is good. Well, during the Protestant Reformation, what is good became rather subjective, and millions of people died in those wars. I don't think either side is innocent, but it's what happened. So Descartes found himself skeptical, confused. So he wanted to fall back upon knowledge of which he could be sure. Hey, how can I know for sure? Well, this was really the beginnings of heavy skepticism. How do I know I exist? How do I know God exists? And even if you look this guy up on Wikipedia, he has 6 meditations here. But this is seen as sort of the shift between authority of God, the church, scripture, and really putting the emphasis of authority on human rationality. Now, it doesn't mean to say people weren't rational before. Many people were. Some of the greatest minds were pre-rationalism. But that's just a cosmic shift. Well, we can keep going. And then you had, Thomas Hobbes, just radically different views of epistemology, or how we know things, of the state, of human nature, of morality, even of art, start taking place around the 15 to 1600s. Now I have some other religions down here in Ancient History of Israel. I have still have these books, the Quran, and books on Hinduism and Buddhism. Well, after the Reformation, after the early modern period, came quickly the Enlightenment period. And I'm sort of getting into that here. Rousseau. Some of these are sort of out of place, but it works for me. So, to continue the skepticism, David Hume was a rather skeptical guy. A Scottish Enlightenment, and again, he questioned miracles. So, how do we know God exists? How do we know that all these miracle claims from the medieval and ancient world, how do we know those are true? We want to be rationalists. Here's Voltaire. We want to be strictly rational. So he cast skepticism on God, miracles, and things like that. The thing is, I didn't understand before, those skeptical trends did not begin with David Hume. They began in the beginnings of the modern period with Descartes. And the only reason Descartes had those skeptical trends in his mind was the uncertainty brought upon by the wars and religious confusion going back between the Catholics and the Protestants. And I don't hold Descartes at fault. I understand. I think a lot of us are skeptical of things because of the culture we live in. Here's some books on epistemology, the study of how we know things. This is Speech Acts. This is Pragmatic Speech Theory. By the way, this is a contemporary book by a contemporary philosopher pointing out that David Hume, his diatribes against miracles they just don't work. And the gentleman who wrote that book isn't a Christian. Adam Smith, Wealth of Nations. This is, it's just sort of the beginnings of the modern capitalism. Thomas Paine. Christopher Hitchens is one of my favorite atheists to read. Sadly passed away of cancer a few years ago. He was a big fan of Jefferson and Thomas Paine. The more I've read, the less I'm a fan of Jefferson and Paine. Thomas Jefferson's Quran, it's pushing a certain ideology, but he did have one. Speeches by Native Americans, chiefs. Up from Slavery, Booker T. Washington. Tales of the South. Now, this gentleman was seen as one of the great American men of letters, sort of like Mark Twain, but he was on the wrong side of the Civil War, and he had views that were not accepted after the Civil War, so his books are harder to find now than Mark Twain's. Now, you can read historians talk about great historical figures, but I find myself liking to read those figures for myself. So I've read a lot of the letters of Jefferson and Madison, Adams, Washington. You learn a lot about them. Jefferson, if you read there's his notes on the state of Virginia, Montaigne. If you read Jefferson's The Spirit of the Laws, Montesquieu, all these books really influenced American political philosophy. John Locke. But Jefferson, in his private letters between John Adams and Jefferson, I think both rejected the Trinity, and by the end of his life, Jefferson was sort of hinting around with the idea that maybe God didn't exist at all. Now, that's not a fundamentalist or an atheist telling me that. That's me reading his letters. He was just a skeptical guy. Different takes on American history. So what's interesting is the Enlightenment dubbed the Middle Ages the Middle Ages. That's not a thing that the Middle Ages folks called themselves. The Enlightenment period, Jefferson, Paine, Voltaire, David Hume, these guys saw themselves as turning on the light after the dark ages of Christianity. And a lot of them held on to Christianity in various forms. A lot of them did not. But they saw the Middle Ages. They saw all this, the ancient Christians and the Middle Ages, as the Dark Ages. Now, if I put myself in their mind, I can sort of understand, because they saw the goal of the state to maximize liberty. Why is that? Well, because they'd lived through the time, or they were remembering when, in the Middle Ages, the end of the Middle Ages, these cultural upheavals, all these religious wars, the 30 Years' War, the Anabaptists taking over a city, the Catholics allowing to be killed John Huss, William Tyndale being burned, I think. You had Bloody Mary, as the Protestants still call her in England. You had Henry VIII and his daughter, Queen Elizabeth, really persecuting Catholics. Some of these things still have effect in Europe. Well, these people were fleeing in all this cultural upheaval. I don't think Luther intended that when he nailed his 95 Theses to the door at Wittenberg. But a lot of cultural upheaval, a lot of confusion. Europe's just changed dramatically. Now, in the past, I've seen all that as progress. Secularists and Baptists would say, hey, this is all progress. Oh boy, I no longer see that as the case. Well, the wars that they had, the persecution of each other, they would establish a state, and it wasn't necessarily religious. It was because they thought the state's job was to promote or enforce what is good. And I think there's some truth there. Aristotle saw things in political philosophy that, and the medievals following him, that we've lost to our harm. But I think they took it a bit too far. Well, when people don't conform to what you say is good, things got violent. Well, that spilled over into this continent. And natives living here, I'm not going to romanticize and say they were all peaceful and that they didn't fight amongst themselves. But the religious war spilled over to this continent. And the natives got wrapped up in that. Even the first great Baptist, Roger Williams, who founded Rhode Island, the state, was just seeking to have a Baptist area free of persecution by perhaps Puritans. Well, that's what the Enlightenment guys had in mind. Hey, we got to get away from all this religious enforcement and just allow people to have some separation of church and state, not a national church, and allow people to live within peace. And we've benefited from that. I'm not sure that that's going to last, but we've benefited from it. And you can understand why. But they became increasingly skeptical of traditional knowledge. Well, that led pretty quickly into, I have a section on atheists. These aren't all atheists. They really aren't. It's sort of a mixed section, but you have Max Weber, the Protestant ethic and the spirit of capitalism, how capitalism works with Christians believing that every job had dignity. I've shared before my first book, philosophy book that I didn't have to buy, was by William James, The Varieties of Religious Experience. This is a book that helped me. So in this period of increasing cultural shifts, hey, the universities that were Christian, Christianity, as far as I can understand, the university is a Christian invention that developed within Christendom. Plato had his academy, the Christians had the university. Well, those universities were originally in some way Catholic, and then the modern Protestants began to establish their own, Princeton, Yale. Well, it became increasingly secular, skeptical. Well, William James was at an Ivy League university arguing against an atheist who was saying, hey, you wouldn't send a ship out to sea unless you were 100% certain that it's seaworthy. So why would you ask us to trust our souls and our culture to Christianity if you're not 100% certain? We need for all the evidence to come in. William James wrote something that really helped me, and that's not it. Actually, I think it might be in this as well. But he wrote and he said, hey, well, initially it was a lecture that I think was converted to a book, but he said, hey, that's not how life works. We all standing in this lecture hall trust in electricity. We haven't studied out electricity. We haven't pieced together every piece of the theory or how it works or the particle level. We don't know that. You just turned on the light. Hey, we're modern Protestant Americans. We believe in progress. We have this faith in progress. Hey, you believe in etc. And he says these are things that not one individual has studied everything out for himself, because no one human being can have infinite data about everything. You can't exhaust every topic. You have to decide. That's why William James is a pragmatist. You have to act based on the best of the information you have. And these guys, he pointed out, who are atheists, hey, they don't think the evidence isn't in. For them, they're being dishonest. The evidence has already come in, and for them, they've already decided it's atheism. And I think William James was pretty truthful there. It's not the full picture, but it was helpful. We have to act and to decide to be paralyzed our whole lives because we're not 100% certain. That's a burden we can't bear. That's a cost we can't pay. We have to make up our minds and act on the best we can. Karl Marx, Das Kapital, Kierkegaard, Rousseau, Nietzsche. I've talked about Nietzsche. I have a video on Nietzsche and Christ. That's a man I've wrestled with quite a bit. By the way, Nietzsche pointed out that in the modern world, many Christians want to keep Christian morality, but they want to discard the orthodox Christian beliefs. And as Nietzsche said, that's folly. It's all going to fall apart. Our moral compass has been broken. He said I think it was the moon. It was the Earth has come loose from the orbit of the sun. We're flying out into space in the darkness. There's no up. There's no down. There's no light. It's getting colder. We're flying out into space. But people didn't understand it, he said in his day, but one day they would. There's Foucault. It just, to my mind, to be totally honest, Jean-Paul Sartre, Foucault, these are the people living, thinking through the aftermath of discarding these traditional moral systems and beliefs, things that were handed to us. Not perfect, but we've discarded them all. And what does that mean? It means we have to choose our own meaning, our own good. And it's not real, it's meaningless. We're damned to be free, as Sartre said. I think I have some more contemporary atheists here. Dawkins, Michael Martin. I've shared how that book, before I studied more, really tore me up. Lawrence Krauss, Daniel Dennett. Of course, The Famous God Delusion by Richard Dawkins. And some other books. Howard Zinn's A People's History of the United States in the movie Good Will Hunting. They promoted that book. Manufacturing Consent. But these are really, literally Marxist reads of American history. They're not wonderful. Mackey on the Miracle of Theism, that's a little older. Sam Harris, How Can You Have Morality If There Is No Objective Morality? All right. Up here I've got an old encyclopedia set not because I believe everything it says, but because it is interesting to see modern definitions in encyclopedias change compared to when that was written. Well, for those of you who don't know, I spent some time in the United States Marine Corps, and that's a memento for me. Michelangelo, and perhaps we'll come back to that. Books on science. I haven't mastered these. Stephen Hawking, I've read those. I've read Einstein's Relativity. There's, hey Alf. No problem. There's Faraday, I've read those recently. That was pretty interesting. Electromagnetic fields, the discovery of those, and Planck. Now, I think this guy, the father of modern chemistry, he was beheaded, if I'm not mistaken, in the French Revolution. All in the name of progress and liberty. Hawking compiling things. I love this little book. I'd probably disagree with this man on a lot of things, but this is just a great book, because I am in a hurry, and this is just kind of a good refresher on astrophysics, particle physics. I had a pastor friend say he read this in seminary. It was pretty cool. But this is just a book that explains how we all have to have paradigms or models for understanding complicated things in the world. And we do the best we can until overwhelming evidence will cause us to adjust or abandon that paradigm. Literature. I am working on improving my understanding of literature, but I love Shakespeare. Macbeth is fantastic. It's dark, but it's fantastic. It wrestles with deep themes. Perhaps we'll make a video one day about that. But poetry, I'm weak on poetry, but I have some of the great poets. John Donne, Ezra Pound. Well, you see this idea of modernity beginning with Descartes and really brought on by the shifts in the Reformation. That affects everything. Ezra Pound, modern poet. Make it new. Off with the old. Off with the dark ages. Brave New World, you know. Coleridge is great. James Joyce, In an Appropriate Green. Ulysses. I need to spend more time in those books, to be honest. Yeah, some of these books are what it's like as a non-white British person in London as an immigrant. Pretty interesting. Virginia Woolf, Mrs. Dalloway. Dickens is great. Old Charles Dickens. John Steinbeck of Mice and Men. Some of the classics. Dostoevsky. I really need to spend more time on Dostoevsky. That's a heavy one. We'll come down here. I'm going to move my desk. Excuse me. We have some contemporary political philosophy. Michael Sandel, he's an Ivy League professor. Now, if you're tired of the arguments between far left and far right, I get it. Michael Sandel, some folks are offering something called not conservatism but communitarianism. It's interesting. Of course, there's libertarian books here, The Common Law by a Supreme Court Justice. I have some legal court cases here, opinions by people who are now Supreme Court Justices, trying to understand what they believe. There's T.S. Eliot, a great modern poet, Ayn Rand. And down here, we've got economics. I've shared these with you before. This is a difficult topic, and I've studied it pretty thoroughly now, but if you want different opinions, Kate Greasley, out of, I think, Oxford, probably offers one of the best opinions about, I don't want to use the word best, but she offers one of the most rigorous opinions about a firmly pro-choice view. And she brings up concerns that are, I think, valid. But I'd also like to recommend a book called Embryo, A Defense of Human Life. And this isn't a religious fundamentalist. He's an Ivy League guy who advises high-caliber people. But he's making the case that we know that this is a growing human life. And if it's a growing, living human being, we don't want to form a system in which corporations for profit can manufacture these things and destroy them for research for profit. If you want something a little less heavy, Love Thy Body, I think is by an evangelical. And it just sort of talks about, at a lay level, Christian views of the body. This is a book on the history of abortion law. It's a complicated topic, and I wouldn't want to offend anybody or get into it. But I do think, at the end of the day, we do want to protect human beings. This is your current events. I've got some Tolkien up here. That's not all of it. He's around the house. I guess I'm reading him somewhere else, but current events, modern voices, The Simple Faith of Mr. Rogers. He saw all the violence and crudeness on TV, and he was trying to help. And he did. He was such an encouragement, but I think it's kind of a shame to see how entertainment industry has gotten worse since his time. But he did a lot of good. This is something that, yeah. Memories. Good and bad. Okay. You know, I deliberately mix some of these different positions up here. I've got The War on the West by Douglas Murray. He's a British person. I don't think that he's a Christian. He's not even really conservative. He's just lamenting the fact that his culture is being eroded. I've got him next to the 1619 Project by the New York Times. And the 1619 Project really is history that was, a read of history that was sort of friends, like Howard Zinn level stuff. But now it's very common, accepted. Historians usually don't accept it, but it's very popular. It's sort of like if you have a fundamentalist read of history that's too pro-America, has a sort of artificial view of our Christianity, this image of America that's not quite right. It leaves out important things. I think, respectfully, this is like that on the far left. It's just not a balanced, accurate read of history. I got a lot of Hitchens. I love Hitchens. Yeah, I went and visited his apartment after he passed in D.C. I watched his final interview. He's wrong on so many things, but he's never boring. Fun guy. Feminism. Second wave, third wave, the debates within feminism. Feminism is no longer a coherent movement. They disagree amongst themselves about so many things, controversial things. Postmodernism. How to deal with Islam in the West. Is it a concern? Is it not a concern, or is it just extremists? Is it the ideology? And of course, we want to be kind and balanced, but also not naive. And these are just different voices with different opinions. And God and Man at Yale. So this is a gentleman who went to Yale in I think the 1940s, perhaps, late 1940s, and he was already pointing out that our Ivy League universities in the 40s were not teaching what the people sending their kids there thought in the 1940s. Whether those things are right or wrong, they're not teaching Christianity, Protestantism, free market so much as they were preaching increasingly left ideas. Gore Vidal, Salman Rushdie, and of course that book got a death threat, a very serious death threat. American singer Cat Stevens called for his death for his blasphemy. Just more books on trying to make sense of the current cultural political moment from various points of view. What's America's role in the world going forward? This is a cool little book by an Oxford professor. He was an atheist who became a Christian. Now he teaches theology, but he also studied, I think, chemistry. So he's a scientist, and he sort of translates between science and Christianity. That's a nice little book. This is interesting. I don't read these as much as I used to, but this is an old issue of The Atlantic, and it was sort of like an exit interview. When former President Obama was leaving office, this was a review of his foreign policy, and it's fairly scathing, even from a leftist perspective. A very winsome fellow, well-spoken. A lot of things I think to respect about him, but with clear vision and hindsight, I think there's a lot to be criticized as well. Just trying to keep up with current events. These are books I'm wrestling through now. These are all books on Roman Catholic theology. This box is from my great-grandfather. Some of these are official documents, some of these are not. So Vatican II Council, but also some philosophy like aesthetics. This is how do we make sense of, what's our theory of art and literature? And I've got some books on just tools on writing to help me sort of polish up my ability to write. Some books on the Marine Corps, some books from the Marine Corps. This is combat school. Fun stuff. Warrior's Return is just a book trying to help people make sense of some difficult things they went through. These are books on different views of how Christianity should relate to culture. So fundamentalism, when the universities, way back in the books I showed you before, were becoming increasingly secular, well, Christianity split over that. Some of the early fundamentalists were very educated people, not what you think of in fundamentalism today. They're very educated, highly educated people, and they split away from the universities thinking they couldn't win there. So they started other universities. Well, they became anti-intellectual very quickly. And then you had the beginnings of the evangelical movement as a response, the uneasy conscience of modern fundamentalism. Some of these verses these books are newer. The Culture Shift is by a Southern Baptist. These are just competing visions on how to make sense of those things. Just as an example, there's the book Jesus and John Wayne, which is sort of a critique of American evangelicalism and Christian masculinity. I do think you could criticize American evangelicalism and Christianity and some of our views on masculinity. The difficult thing is books like this often aren't criticizing with a clear mind or clear eyes. They're importing their own ideology that probably isn't any better than the thing they're criticizing. That's my take. My Bibles. Again, my in-laws bought me for this, and it's just one of the most meaningful gifts I've ever gotten. It's sort of falling apart now, but it's been a wonderful gift. So this is my preferred version of Richard Wagner's The Ring Cycle. This is put on by the Metropolitan Opera, and it's a beast, man. I haven't actually finished this, but I love the production value of it. This thing's like, I think 18 hours or something like that. But what I have seen is just fantastic. You have to really set aside time and attention. But as you probably know, and we've talked about before, Nietzsche and Wagner were good friends, and Nietzsche looked up to Wagner. But eventually they split ways over anti-Semitism and Christianity. And of course, Nietzsche thought that the future for Germany and Europe would be in the heroic pagan pre-Christian past. And eventually Wagner seemed to part ways with him. And actually, Nietzsche took it personally. He wrote a book against Wagner, his former friend and mentor. But this is a retelling of, sort of a retelling of old Germanic myths. Tolkien, of course, really pulled heavily from these myths that Wagner pulls from for this opera. And it's pretty cool just to be aware of these things. These are Roger Scruton, my Scruton section. He's a British conservative who sadly passed away. But basically, he just tries to point us back to this great tradition. I don't know if he became an Anglican after leaving atheism. I don't know how much he really believed in Christianity, except that he understood that Christianity is to thank for so many of the things that we take for granted. And it's true. If I were an atheist, I would be forced to believe that by the evidence. Our literature, art, legal theory, belief in human dignity and moral worth, hospitals, a lot of these things really developed. Even modern science developed. And that's not because I'm a Christian. There's a book called The Beginnings of Western Science by David Lindbergh. I don't think he's a Christian, but he just points out that science didn't just begin with these guys that they'd have you tell, as they tell you. It began long ago, and the intellectual roots of science began with the Greeks and through the Christian period. Anyways, Scruton understood all that, and he's a brave man. But he did try to, in some way, rescue Western Civ by just trying to get us in touch with the transcendent through art. I think eventually he realized that wasn't enough, but he's a guy I respect. And he called out Foucault and folks like them to the detriment of his own career. I got some technical books down there on applied science. Here's my action figures. You guys can't see my comic book collection right now, but I've got some cool action figures. These guys are about to start a rock band. This is one of my favorite Superman comics, Kingdom Come. It's fantastic if you ever get the chance to read it. That's my son's favorite Jedi. There's E.T. hiding back there. This is sand from Normandy Beach, where the Allies landed to free France from the evil Nazi occupation. A lot of Virginians died from where I got this sand. C.S. Lewis and G.K. Chesterton. I've read quite a bit of Lewis. I haven't mastered everything he's written. He's just had a gift for communicating difficult philosophical, theological ideas in a way that's easy to understand, perhaps through story, imagery. So I respect the guy. Of course, he communicated to Great Britain about Christianity and the value of their own culture in a time in which they faced the insurmountable evil of Nazi Germany. So G.K. Chesterton, he's a guy that I'm respecting and admiring more and more. He's sort of like the Christian Nietzsche. His language is dense, but his imagery is pretty profound. His language is just colorful and flavorful, and he packs a lot in to few words. It's easy to listen to or read his books and just let it slip right past you, but if you pay attention, he's got some meaningful things to say. in his critiques of modernity, atheism, secularism. He's an interesting character. Even in his own native England, he was a Roman Catholic, I believe, which is sort of an oddity for them, I think. But I was reading H.G. Wells, who, of course, is a sci-fi author, but also an atheist. I was reading his Outline of Human History, and someone recommended, you need to balance that out with some G.K. Chesterton, Orthodoxy and the Everlasting Man. Fair enough. So I did, and he's definitely a worthy read. These are books on trying to make sense of culture, art, film, how to interpret those things from different perspectives. This is, we were able to go see LeVar Burton narrate an orchestra performing Gustav Holst's The Planets and some Star Trek music, and that was just a wonderful night. He's just a lovely guy. And this is called An Unexpected Journal, kind of taking a cue from The Hobbit. These guys are Christians, educated Christians, who analyze culture, films, books, etc. from a Christian point of view. Check them out sometime. They have a website, Unexpected Journal. And this one's about a lady named Holly Ordway, who I think is just someone I immensely respect. She's got a keen mind and a brave soul. And even when I don't agree with her, oftentimes when I've disagreed with her, I found out I was wrong. But she's understood so many of these things I've showed you, these books and ideas. And she's followed bravely what she thought was the truth. And I greatly admire that. Some psychology, some Jung. I'm interested in Jung's symbolism. Of course, he was at competition with his former mentor, Sigmund Freud. These are books Master Yoda and I sometimes hang out in here and study together, train together. These are books I'm still kind of working with in my mind. I haven't read Sapiens, for example. I need to. Everyone tells me it's really interesting. But Derrida, that's sort of a key thinker in postmodernism, and this idea that whatever's established must be deconstructed. Whatever's at the center must be leveled out, and those things around the margins must be brought in. I think they've taken that idea to the extreme. This book is great. It's a book about leisure, and that doesn't mean consuming entertainment. It means it's okay to be bored sometimes. It's okay to work not for the sake of work or even wealth, but to work so that we can afford the things worth doing in life that make life meaningful, like reading philosophy, or talking about a home library, or pursuing art. So a lot of Christians in American culture have grown up fundamentalist or evangelical, and we find ourselves watching those movements sort of fall apart and fragment, and many of us become atheists, or people who just simply don't care about faith or philosophy or history. But many of us have a couple of options. We stay in fundamentalism and sort of turn our mind off to certain things. And I don't mean that disrespectfully. I know it sounds that way, and I've had men who were fundamentalists, pastors, who helped me and loved me, and I could share names with you of people who might be hated publicly, but I've seen behind closed doors how they loved people and were so charitable and tried to help people who hurt them. So there's a lot of good. Someone once said it's never nothing. Christianity in all its forms, it's never nothing, right? There's good people, and that's what they know. But some of us who don't want to stay in that strict fundamentalism or evangelicalism, we have a choice between going, sort of this hipster church and say we're going to roll back and not be as concerned about doctrine, or maybe kind of compromise a few things in our mind to secular culture. Others of us say we want something deeper. We want to be in closer contact to traditional historic Christianity. We want to go further in. We want to have a deeper understanding of these things. And that's where books like this come in. This is a book about evangelicals who are attracted to traditional Anglicanism, the liturgy, the practices, the worship, the doctrine of the ancient church. Well, that brings me back over here. By the way, that's my Marine Corps cover. This is a friend gave this to me. It's so cool. I need to hang it up. Good old Enterprise D. Well, after studying philosophy and history, and I've not mastered it, but I thought for a time I'd be an atheist or someone who just doesn't care. But I really do think Christianity is true. And ironically, after reading some sort of fundamentalist theology in the past, some of this is liberal theology, by the way, breaking away from that and studying philosophy and history and trying to make sense of it all in current events, it's brought me right back here. Now I'm reading more theology than I think ever. These are the historic books of the Reformation. Calvin, Luther, the creeds and confessions of the Protestant denominations. This is the 1689 Baptist Confession of London, the Westminster Confession. Many Christians still hold to this. They may not know the circumstances in which that document was produced. There was a lot of war, violent takeovers. There's an Eastern Orthodox catechism. Luther's an interesting guy. The more I read him, to be honest, the more I dislike him. I think he's probably like the Christopher Hitchens of his day. He's very colorful language. I won't repeat to you in this video some of the things he said. Railing against the establishment, but maybe not with a lot to offer in return. These are, I think, the key points of disagreement between Protestants and the traditional Catholic Church. The Book of Romans and Justification. And that would be a video in and of itself, but I'm trying to read every perspective on that. Here's, by the way, these are books, people realizing the shortcomings in evangelical saying, hey, just pray the prayer. And we need to present a more fuller picture of the gospel to people. And some evangelicals are noticing that. But we come down here, and really, this will show you, these two books, I'd recommend them. They'll show you some of the shortcomings in the Reformation, the unintended consequences, the stripping of religious art, the destruction of church property, the violence. And really, this book alone will show you that it was the Reformation that set us on the road to consumerism and secularism. Those men were devout Christians, and they would not have intended that. But they broke down walls and set us on a path that eventually led to this, and this, and eventually to where we are now. I hope that makes some sense to you. And perhaps we'll talk about it again soon. There's some more books on history if I didn't show you. So I don't have time to work out as much as I'd like. So I keep some weights in here just to keep from becoming utterly weak. I will say right up there is some art. And the art behind that statue shows what I think the medievals saw as the answer to everything. It's a unification of heaven and earth. There's not a hard boundary anymore because of Christ to them. So physicists today look for this grand unified field theory, the theory of everything. For physicists, they're trying to unite the fundamental forces of nature. But I think that historical Christianity has some sense of a grand theory of everything. I think they have answers to why we exist, why are we moral creatures, What rights do we have? What moral responsibilities do we have? What's wrong with us? There's a lot of wonderful things about humanity, but clearly we can all agree that we're broken. How can we be fixed? Where's all this going? What's the point? Is there any meaning? I think in Christ, as represented in this art, there's answers to all of that. An historic Christian will believe that as well. But I think out of all my studies, that painting, that might represent what I'm coming to conclude it really is everything I've looked for. Hey folks, thanks again for taking the time to walk with me through my library. I really do appreciate it. Hey, I hope perhaps you'll be encouraged to pick up a book, maybe something you haven't read before, or about some idea or topic in history. Maybe you've seen something on the shelves here, that you'd just feel comfortable picking it up and taking some time to spend some time in that book. Hey, but don't set unobtainable goals. Sometimes if I see a project or a task at hand, it just seems overwhelming to me, the scope of it. I've found something that's been helpful to me is to just sort of break it down into steps and start somewhere. And then eventually, you don't eat the whole elephant at once. You just take one bite at a time. And I hope perhaps some of you might do that as well. I think some liberal people tend to see utopia in the future, and some conservative people tend to suspect utopia somewhere in the past. I'm not really sure that utopia can be found in either one of those places. But I do think if we try to think, as Adler said, syntopically, and see how all these ideas, thinkers, have affected our culture, and they all sort of are in the same conversation together. For my own part, I'm starting to see that the modern and postmodern world is the resonance of the past is being lost, this great chorus of voices, this democracy of the dead, and there's more dissonance today. But what I do think we can see is that how all these ideas fit together. Someone once said that if I see further than other men, it's because I stand on the shoulder of giants. And I think that's true for us as well. My lifetime is only so long. My experience is very limited. I can only gain so much knowledge and wisdom and experience in my own life, maybe what my parents told me, my education, my own life experience. But if we back up and listen to all these different voices of the past, we get a much broader context. So hey, this is a worthy endeavor. And I hope you're just encouraged to pick up another book. Someone once said, take a look. It's in a book. So I appreciate your time, and as always, God bless.